So what if the concept of brainwashing, the kind that conjures up images straight out of Cold War spy novels, what if it's actually far more pervasive and maybe much harder to define than we think?
That's a really good starting point.
What if it's less about, like, covert operations and secret labs and more about the subtle, everyday ways our minds are shaped, often without us even realizing it?
It's a truly compelling question because honestly, for anyone who's really dug into this topic, myself included, it actually becomes, well, less knowable the longer I've taught it. It keeps this sort of murky, do I really see this
Yeah,
quality?
it's slippery.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
just eludes exact measurement, throughout its history.
Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into the evolution of brainwashing and mind control. We'll explore its murky origins, those dramatic historical cases that really brought it to public attention.
And crucially, how those very same techniques, or at least the underlying principles, have kind of evolved into the hyper-persuasion we encounter, well, everywhere in our digital lives.
Exactly. Our mission here is to unpack this really complex topic. We want to extract the most important insights from historical accounts, psychological research, contemporary analysis.
The idea is that you'll gain a clearer understanding of what makes us susceptible to influence, how seemingly disparate events are actually connected.
And perhaps even recognize some of these forces at play in your own daily experience. That's the hope.
Definitely.
And to do this, we're going to use a powerful method. It's called the actors category.
Yeah.
This means we won't just ask, was this person brainwashed? That's too simple. Instead, we'll try to understand these phenomena from the involved person's point of view before rushing to judgment or, imposing our own assumptions.
So looking at it from the inside out, in a way.
Precisely. Like when we talk about prisoners of war, we'll delve into their lived experience, ask what led them to a certain state, rather than just slapping a label on them. It could be truly eye-opening.
It really can. Okay, so when we talk about brainwashing, the term itself has a bit of a hazy beginning, doesn't it?
Yeah, where did it even come from?
It sort of emerged in the mid-20th century. Joost Meerler's 1956 book, The Rape of the Mind, was pretty influential. He described it as forced submission or even menticide, killing the mind.
Menticide.
Well, right from the start, it's always been incredibly difficult to precisely define or measure, which explains that persistent, murky, do I really see this quality we mentioned.
And the academic world's take on it, that's really shifted over time, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And initially, especially back in the 1990s, a lot of scholars just dismissed brainwashing. They saw it as a hysterical cultural reaction, maybe a political cover-up with no real reality to it.
So it created this weird split.
Yeah, this bizarre dichotomy where it was felt to be all too real in the public imagination, but not real at all in academia. A total disconnect. But thankfully, recent work by scholars in human and brain sciences, people like Killen, Pick, Dimsdale, Holmes, they're taking some really stimulating new directions.
Okay, so things are changing.
Yes, and importantly, there's been this renewed interest in cults, which has brought the critical role of trauma back to the forefront of the discussion. Recognizing its profound impact is key.
Okay, let's unpack this with some of that dramatic historical context, starting with the Cold War, because that seems pivotal.
It really was.
The Korean War specifically seems to be where brainwashing burst into the public consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Through the experiences of U.S. prisoners of war like Morris Wills held in those desolate Yalu River wastelands.
Exactly. Mao's method, sometimes it was just called the method or re-education or thought reform. It wasn't just used on Chinese citizens. It was applied to captured U.S., Greek, Turkish, British, Australian, South Korean troops. Pretty much anyone they captured.
And the camps themselves, they were almost like labs.
In a way, yes. They function as a test, almost like a laboratory setting, to see if the method could actually reshape the minds of Westerners.
And there was that strange angle about how they viewed them, GIs as peasants.
Right. GIs were seen as class doubles of Chinese peasants, and officers were equated with landholders. It fit their ideological framework. Mao Zedong himself even viewed this thought reform as a, quote, spiritual atom bomb.
A spiritual atom bomb. That tells you how powerful they thought it was.
It really does. Morris Wills, one of those POWs, described his experience as a long, horrible process. He said he slowly, step by step, idea by idea, became totally convinced of the communist ideology.
How did that even start?
It began with severe ungrounding, a deliberate psychological destabilization, taking away everything familiar. Then came steps like, believe it or not, reading from a camp library.
Reading. That sounds Benign.
Well, they made it deceptively appealing. There was a pot-bellied stove, even warm wheat buns nearby sometimes. It wasn't just brute force.
No. And then there was this next step, criticism. That sounds more intense.
It was. This is where instructors would re-narrate, interpreted, criticize the stories prisoners told about themselves, basically rewriting their personal history. There's a Communist Party report on Chinese prostitutes, for example, that showed this process leading them to supposedly recognize who our true enemies were as their minds gradually became clear. It was about fundamentally altering a person's self-perception, their identity.
And the trauma aspect? Was that recognized at the time?
That's the thing. It's often overlooked, even though these POWs experienced, distress beyond imagining, physical torture, psychological abandonment. The early behavioral scientists studying them didn't really mobilize trauma in their understanding.
They missed it.
Almost entirely. This vital element just wasn't part of the framework then.
So when the war ended, these repatriation operations, Little Switch and Big Switch, brought thousands of POWs home. But it wasn't just a simple homecoming, was it?
Not at all. These returning men weren't just welcomed, they immediately became objects of study on floating laboratories, in interrogation chambers. They were subjected to these exhaustive 77-page questionnaires, intelligence tests, Rorschach ink blots, the works.
Treated like lab rats, almost.
In a sense. And the experts discovered, quote-unquote, a widespread infection with indoctrination. This led to this taint of brainwashing being felt, really, by all Korean War veterans, whether they'd collaborated or not.
That must have been incredibly difficult for them. And there was also that volleyball problem.
Yes, the infamous volleyball problem. Chinese propaganda images showing these seemingly plump, happy POWs playing volleyball were circulated.
To undermine their stories of suffering.
Exactly. It intentionally undermined claims of mistreatment back home. A really potent early example of weaponizing perception to control the narrative.
Absolutely. And the Chinese press ran stories about U.S. POWs converting, painting it as this positive and effective thought remolding.
Right, and sometimes they specifically highlighted African-American servicemen who supposedly converted because of perceived McCarthyism and racial persecution back in the States, using existing social fissures.
Which brings up that whole ambiguity around collaboration.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out who resisted versus who collaborated.
Yeah.
It sounds messy.
Oh, incredibly messy. Studies trying to categorize resistors versus collaborators within that camp environment really struggled. The very definition of collaboration became so hazy, so context-dependent, that statistics about it were basically meaningless.
And then the focus might have obscured other things.
It did. This intense focus on who was a collaborator, who wasn't. It unfortunately sidestepped the overwhelming evidence of trauma that these individuals had clearly endured.
Okay, so while all this is happening with the POWs and becoming public knowledge, the military and intelligence agencies were also exploring this from another angle, right? Clandestinely.
Yes, which brings us to a quick but important sidebar. MK-ULTRA and a figure named Dr. Louis J. West.
MK-ULTRA, the infamous CIA program.
The very same. Dr. West was an Air Force psychiatrist who, back in 1953, offered his services to this ultra-secret program.
And what was he proposing?
Well, what's particularly unsettling is that West proposed experiments exploring ways to, and I'm quoting here, shape the subjective states or warping the will of a human subject.
Shaping subjective states, warping the will, that's chilling.
It is. And he planned to use incapacitating agents, such as but not limited to LSD, and incapacitating procedures, such as but not limited to hypnosis.
So, drugs and hypnosis to control minds.
Essentially, and he went beyond just LSD. He researched how to make people dissociate that feeling of detachment from reality using things like sensory deprivation, stimulating or disorienting drugs, hypnosis.
What was the goal?
His stated goal was to quantify how to create altered personalities. He even described his work as a kind of psychopathological reactions lab, studying how our reality testing behavior, our basic ability to assess the world accurately, was affected by different stressors.
Were there ethical concerns raised? I mean, it sounds ethically fraught.
Absolutely. And this work definitely had, let's say, ethical ambiguities. West was connected to Aldous Huxley, interestingly enough. His record-keeping was also notably less diligent than the CIA's official logs.
Covering tracks.
Perhaps. And there was the very concerning case of Jimmy Shaver, an airman who committed murder and had amnesia, and whom West had treated previously. The connections are disturbing.
Okay, so that's the clandestine side. But manipulation of the mind wasn't just happening in secret labs or POW camps. Sometimes it got even more direct, more invasive.
Yes, sometimes it ventured right into the brain itself. Psychosurgery.
Right. Let's look at that troubling case involving Leonard Kill. He was an Air Force veteran whose personal struggles led him down a really controversial path.
And this whole area, psychosurgery for behavioral control, it gained broader public attention partly because of the case of Charles Whitman.
The University of Texas shooter.
Yes. After the shooting, doctors controversially discovered a brain tumor pressing on his amygdala, that's the part of the brain linked to emotion and aggression. This led some doctors to believe, perhaps prematurely, that specific brain abnormalities could directly cause violence.
A biological cause for violence.
That was the thinking. So when Leonard Kill had electrodes implanted in his brain in October 1966, followed by 9 months of what they called pre-treatment stimulation.
Stimulating his brain with electrodes.
Yes. After that, doctors recommended a double amygdalectomy, basically removing parts of his amygdala. His wife even threatened divorce if he refused the surgery.
Immense pressure.
Absolutely. And despite his own resistance, doctors eventually induced him to agree to surgery. They presented it as this far more high-tech and less damaging procedure than the old lobotomy.
And still removing parts of the brain to control behavior.
Exactly. And this practice generated a huge ethical outcry, especially around a proposed violence center in Los Angeles that would have involved psychosurgery. There were protests, Fire Irvin signs against its main proponent, Frank Irvin.
And this wasn't isolated.
No, this era also saw, disturbingly, a brisk traffic in human subjects for drug company experimentation and psychosurgeries being performed on prisoners in places like Vacaville Prison in California.
A really dark chapter. Okay, let's shift back to the broader societal level. The 1970s you mentioned, especially after the Manson trial, that really brought cults into the spotlight.
It did. The Manson trial had what was called the Great Brainwashing Offense, and that really solidified the public's awareness of mind control in the context of these groups.
And it wasn't just a fringe thing, was it?
Not at all. It was a widespread phenomenon. Estimates suggest maybe 2.5 million people joined what were then called cultic groups. By the 21st century, over 5,000 such groups were thought to be operating in the U.S. and Canada alone.
And we call them something different now.
Often, yes. They're frequently referred to now as groups of psychological abuse, or GPAs, shifting the focus to the methods used.
What's really striking, though, is the impact on those born into these groups.
Ah, yes. That's a unique and tragic aspect. The estimated 125,000 individuals born and raised in cults, their trauma often had a different texture and persistence than those who joined later in life. It highlights a really distinct, profound kind of psychological shaping from birth.
Can you give an example of how someone might get drawn in?
Ray Connolly's story with the Children of God is quite illustrative. He described experiencing intense love bombing, at first overwhelming affection and attention.
Love bombing, right.
Then it graduated to good cop, bad cop warnings, creating confusion and dependence. And ultimately, he felt this mysterious inability to leave, even when he desperately wanted to and wasn't physically restrained.
He couldn't just walk away?
He described it as finding himself mastering the art of managing cognitive dissonance. That mental gymnastics you do when your beliefs clash with your actions or reality, holding conflicting ideas simultaneously.
Which brings us to probably the most famous case involving this defense.
Yeah.
The Patricia Hearst trial in 1976.
The Great Brainwashing Defense, yes. Hearst, as many know, was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA.
And her defense team brought in big names.
They did. Expert witnesses like Dr. Weston McGinn, Dr. Martin Orrin, and Robert J. Lifton testified. They compared her experience directly to that of the Korean War POWs and diagnosed her condition as traumatic neurosis.
But it didn't work.
Ultimately, no. The defense largely backfired. Part of the problem was that, at the time, true trauma was still seen as something only grown men in duress experienced.
Seriously. So because she was a woman and her situation was different from a POW camp.
Exactly. It made her less sympathetic to the jury. This very narrow societal view of what constituted real trauma essentially invalidated her experience. It's a stark reminder of how biases shaped the understanding of mental states then. Very different from today.
That's incredible. This period also saw the rise of deprogramming, didn't it?
Yes, indeed. Theodore Ted Roosevelt Patrick Jr., known as Black Lightning, became the first really prominent deprogrammer.
And what did he do?
He would often literally abduct followers, taking them back to their families against their will. And notably, he drew that direct comparison again. He analogized cult members to Korean War POWs, claiming, quote, "The technique is the same as the North Koreans used."
So the POW narrative was still very powerful.
Extremely. And this ultimately fueled the so-called cult wars of the 1980s. You had psychologists defending former cult members on one side and academics defending religious freedom on the other.
Fighting over whether brainwashing was even real.
Pretty much fiercely debating whether brainwashing was a real thing. Interestingly, the CIA's own internal conclusions from the MK Ultra program, though secret then, were that no, you could not create a totally controlled automaton with or without force.
So even the CIA didn't think total control was possible.
According to their findings, no. And we should also note there was a significant financial aspect to the cult wars. Experts like Margaret Singer received lucrative stipends for testifying in court cases.
Money complicates things.
Always. However, a really significant ruling came from the American Psychological Association, the APA, in 1987. They largely ruled negatively against Singer's theoretical approach to cult brainwashing, stating it lacks scientific rigor.
So, a major setback for that specific brainwashing model.
A huge one. The APA also stated that the Korean War dynamics did not translate to these new cult contexts. It wasn't a direct parallel.
So if it's not just like the POWs, what is it?
This is where sociologist Benjamin Zablocki's view becomes crucial. He argued that brainwashing, or coercive influence, is about relationships, not about individual dispositions.
So it's less about a person being inherently weak-minded.
Exactly. And more about the power dynamics within the social environment, the relationships involved. That's the key.
And that relational understanding. That feels like a bridge to today, doesn't it?
It really does. If brainwashing is fundamentally about relationships and the social environment, not just individual weakness, then we can see how this phenomenon evolves or maybe manifests differently as hyper-persuasion in our modern digital age.
Hyper-persuasion, okay.
Where our emotional life, especially intense and difficult emotions, are literally harvested from users and harnessed in social media. Harvested and harnessed.
That sounds extractive.
It is. And this isn't just some abstract theory. Think about the Hawaii study on emotional contagion.
Right. What did that show?
It showed how people unconsciously mimic facial expressions and vocal patterns to literally catch emotions from others, like yawning.
Okay.
And the researchers concluded, quite presciently, about the awesome contemporary power of celebrityhood and of the mass media as these agencies of large-scale emotional and cognitive contagion continue to expand their capacities to define reality for billions of people. They saw it coming.
Defining reality through emotional contagion.
Wow.
Which leads us, I guess, directly to something like Facebook.
Or Meta, yes. Facebook's emotional engineering experiments, there was that vast shift around, say, 2012, 2014, when the sort of open web really became the social web.
When everything moved inside the walled gardens.
Pretty much. And as a result, all the procedures of massive scale emotional engineering accelerated as if on steroids. Every click, every pause.
All activity now counted as digital treasure.
Precisely. Leading to this potential for society-wide tuning of shared psychological states, tuning us like instruments.
And people felt it, didn't they? What was the reaction?
The reaction was visceral. You had users saying things like, "You can't mess with my emotions. It's like messing with me. It's mind control." People recognized this deep influence, even if they couldn't fully articulate how it worked.
But this idea of mass emotional manipulation, it's not entirely new, is it? You mentioned historical precedent.
Not entirely new, no. We can see earlier forms of mass persuasion. Take Kate Smith's 1943 war bond drive during World War II. It was done entirely via radio.
And it was successful.
Astonishingly successful. She raised $39 million, a huge sum then in just 3 days. Listeners reported feeling emotionally chained to their radios, unable to switch off, unable even to go to bed. They were captivated.
Emotionally chained. That's a powerful phrase.
Isn't it? And Robert K. Merton wrote a classic book called Mass Persuasion, studying this very phenomenon. He noted that it wasn't just products that could be sold this way.
But ideas.
Yep.
Candidates.
Exactly. Political candidates could successfully enter the psyches of a populace through these large-scale persuasive media processes. It was a fascinating early look at media's power to shape opinion and emotion on a grand scale.
And that connects to a shift in how social science even thought about groups of people.
Yeah?
From crowds to masses.
Yes. That's a really interesting theoretical shift. Earlier, social science often studied crowds, which were seen as having a kind of collective soul, being boisterously passionate, maybe unpredictable, but alive.
Okay.
But in the 20th century, the focus shifted towards studying masses. Masses were conceptualized differently, seen as faceless, operating more by blind biomechanistic response.
Less agency.
Much less, almost like an audience first, waiting to be imprinted, ready to be molded. This shift in thinking, of course, connects directly to the rise of 20th century fascism and the calculated power of propaganda films, like Leni Riefenstahl's infamous work for the Nazis. The goal was explicitly to mold the collective psyche.
Okay, so if we bring that understanding forward to today, are there modern analogies?
I think there are some striking ones. Think about the experience of being caught in a cult versus the feeling of being stuck in a scroll. Doom scrolling, anxiety scrolling on your phone.
How are they similar?
Well, both often begin in the ordinary and transforms it, rendering it strange. You start casually, then find yourself pulled in, becoming, in a way, a prisoner of a dynamic you are unable fully to understand.
You lose track of time, you feel compelled.
Right, you get pulled in, not always consciously, by forces that are subtly shaping your reality, your mood, your focus.
And this kind of dynamic shows up elsewhere, too. Like, in finance.
Oh, definitely. The cryptocurrency market, for instance, has often been described using the language of cults, a cult-like movement.
Really? How so?
You hear terms like hopium, that intense, almost desperate hope that a particular coin will skyrocket. There are clear, true believer dynamics. Their motto is often, don't trust, verify, relying on the blockchain's supposed objectivity.
And the blockchain itself is seen as?
Sometimes framed as almost salvational, like the answer to everything. It's been compared, perhaps provocatively, to the cry of John from he come.
John from, who's that? Is that related to those cargo cults?
Exactly. To understand that comparison, we need to look at the real-world phenomenon of the John from cargo cults. They emerged in Vanuatu in the South Pacific, primarily after the massive U.S. military presence there during World War II.
What happened?
Well, the islanders saw these Americans arrive with incredible amounts of material wealth, cargo. Airplanes, radios, processed food, all sorts of things they'd never seen.
Okay.
So attempting to understand and replicate this sudden influx of wealth, they started emulating the Americans' behaviors. They built bamboo desks, made paper out of leaves, constructed elaborate wooden airstrips, even made radio belong John contraptions out of wood and vines.
Trying to attract the cargo back.
Precisely. They were trying to attract American-style cargo riches by mimicking the rituals and objects they associated with its arrival. It's this powerful illustration of people trying to understand and control seemingly inexplicable, powerful external forces by copying the visible signs of power.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And you see parallels with crypto's don't trust, verify.
Well, in a way, yes. Both involve adopting specific rituals or belief systems, like faith in the blockchain code, in the hope of accessing a powerful, perhaps poorly understood, external system, whether it's ancestral spirits bringing cargo or market forces bringing crypto wealth. It's about finding ways to navigate forces that feel beyond individual control.
It's a way of making sense of the overwhelming.
Exactly. And what's truly illuminating here is how these seemingly disparate examples, from Cold War POW camps to 70s cults to radio bond drives to crypto markets to cargo cults, they all demonstrate this consistent human pattern. We try to seek control or understanding when faced with powerful, sometimes completely overwhelming external influences.
Even something like the selfie fits in.
Well, the selfie itself isn't actually new. The first known photographic self-portrait was taken by a chemist named Robert Cornelius way back in 1839.
No way. 1839.
Yep. So self-documentation is part of a much longer human history. But the digital age, social media, has amplified its capacity for social influence exponentially.
Right. Which brings us back to that idea of hyper-persuasion.
Yes, and specifically to Sinan Aral's concept of runaway social influence in the digital age. His point is that we're hyper-socialized now.
Hyper-socialized.
Meaning exposure to others' opinions at the point of decision is the norm, not the exception. Think about online reviews, likes, follower counts. We constantly see what others think before or as we make choices.
It's unavoidable.
Pretty much. And this leads to our judgments becoming systematically and algorithmically interdependent. Our choices influence the algorithm, which influences others' choices, which influences ours. It's a feedback loop.
And this is how those strong emotions get generated online.
Precisely. This is how fear, anxiety, hope, outrage, how they're conjured and amplified when we are, to use that phrase again, emotionally chained to our technologies. It's this continuous, often invisible tug of war for our attention and our emotional state.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We certainly have.
We've journeyed from, The intense forced conversions of Cold War POWs and those dramatic cult trials of the 70s, all the way to the subtle, pervasive influence of our digital platforms, even touching on things like cryptocurrency and cargo cults.
And hopefully you've seen how the underlying principles of shaping minds, whether it's through outright coercion or this newer hyper-persuasion, how they've evolved in method, but maybe remain remarkably constant in their fundamental effect on us.
Right. So the final question then, I guess, is what does this all mean for you listening right now?
Yeah, what's the takeaway? If brainwashing or maybe coercive influence is truly about relationships and social context, not just individual weakness, and if the most powerful forms of influence today are the ones that feel like our own choices, the ones embedded in the platforms we use every day,
then how can we truly discern what's genuinely our thought and what's merely an algorithm's suggestion, or a subtle social nudge, or an engineered emotional response?
it's tough. How do we keep that original big question alive, as the source material puts it? The question about who we are and how we are shaped, when the very forces shaping us are so expertly integrated, so seamlessly woven into our daily lives.
It really raises a fundamental question for our time, doesn't it? What truly constitutes freedom of thought in an increasingly and perhaps unavoidably hyper-persuasive world?
That's the question to ponder.